At his granddaughter's funeral, suspecting that something was amiss, the man approached the casket and leaned in to listen closely. The sound he heard shocked him, and he immediately had to open the casket. Maverick Edwards sat on the creaky porch swing, his hands clasped tightly around a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at the horizon with hollow eyes. The laughter that once filled this home had long since faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. It had been a year since the accident, yet the memory of his son and daughter-in-law's smiling faces haunted him like fresh ghosts. "Maverick, you've got to keep moving," his neighbor Sally had told him last week, dropping off a casserole he hadn't touched. But what did she know about losing everything in a single moment? Moving on wasn't an option. Surviving barely was all he could manage. Yet somehow, 7-year-old Ariana had pulled him from the brink. Her laughter wasn't quite as carefree as before, but it was there, fragile and persistent. She didn't cry much anymore, not openly. Instead, she clung to him, her bright eyes watching his every move, as if afraid he might vanish too. "Grandpa," she'd said that morning, tugging at his sleeve as he fixed her breakfast. "Can I braid your hair when I'm done eating?" Maverick had chuckled, despite himself. "Braid my hair? I don't have enough left, kiddo." "You do on the sides?" she giggled, her spoon clinking against the cereal bowl. Moments like that kept him going. For her, he had to keep going. Maverick wasn't always this way. He used to whistle while working on cars in his small garage, chatting with neighbors who brought their rust buckets to him for repairs. He'd been the kind of man who remembered birthdays, baked pies for fundraisers, and took his son fishing every summer. Losing Luke and Beth in that twisted heap of metal had gutted him, leaving him a man he barely recognized. But Ariana, she was the thread keeping him tethered to something that resembled purpose. Their days fell into a rhythm: breakfast, school drop-offs, homework, bedtime stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and Maverick clung to that steadiness like a lifeline. The rain started suddenly that Thursday afternoon, a cold downpour that soaked through their jackets as they walked home from school. Ariana held Maverick's hand tightly, skipping over puddles while he muttered about the weather ruining his freshly mended boots. "Grandpa, wait!" she cried, her small hand jerking free as she darted ahead. Maverick's heart stopped. "Ariana, don't run!" he shouted, his voice harsher than intended. But she wasn't running away. She had stopped a few feet ahead, crouching by the side of the road. Something brown and limp lay there, half hidden by tall grass. "It's a dog," she whispered, her voice trembling with equal parts wonder and worry. Maverick sighed, his boots squelching in the mud as he approached. "A stray, looks like. Might be sick or worse. Leave it be, Ariana." She turned to him, eyes wide, and pleading. "We can't just leave him. He's hurt." He crouched next to her, inspecting the animal. The small dog shivered violently, its fur matted with dirt and rain. One paw was twisted at an odd angle, and its ribs jutted out sharply beneath the wet fur. Maverick sighed heavily. "We don't have the money for vet bills," he muttered, shaking his head. "But we can at least try," Ariana begged, her voice cracking. "He looks so scared, Grandpa. Please?" Her voice, that fragile tremor, pierced him deeper than he'd admit. With a resigned grunt, he slid his arms under the dog, cradling it against his chest. It didn't resist, too weak to do more than whimper softly. "You've got a soft heart, kid," he said gruffly, though his own heart felt heavier as he carried the dog home. They worked together to clean the dog up, Ariana carefully wiping mud from its eyes while Maverick fashioned a makeshift splint for the injured leg. The dog watched them with cautious eyes, flinching at every sudden movement but never growling or snapping. "He needs a name," Ariana announced as they tucked him into an old blanket near the heater. "Let's wait to see if he pulls through first," Maverick replied, though he knew better than to argue when she was determined. "Romeo," she decided firmly, "because he needs love, and we're going to give it to him." Maverick chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "Romeo, huh? Well, let's hope he's a survivor." By the end of the week, Romeo had perked up considerably. Ariana had spent every spare minute by his side, and Maverick couldn't help but notice how much her mood had lifted. She laughed more, hummed while brushing her teeth, and even sang little songs to Romeo that she made up on the spot. One morning, as she knelt beside the dog, Maverick walked over and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You've got a knack for this, kiddo," he said. Ariana looked up at him with wide eyes. "For what?" "Taking care of others," he said softly. "Your mum had that same gift, you know." A shadow flickered across her face, but she nodded, her fingers still combing through Romeo's fur. "I just want him to be happy," she said. "Like, really happy." Maverick swallowed hard and gave her shoulder a squeeze. "You're doing a good job." He knows he's loved. As the days turned into weeks, the house began to feel a little less empty. Maverick couldn't deny the difference Romeo made, not just for Ariana, but for himself. Watching the two of them together stirred something he hadn't felt in a long time. A faint but persistent hope. Every evening after dinner, Maverick would sit on the porch, a habit he'd picked up when the silence inside became too heavy. It didn't take long before Ariana started joining him, dragging a blanket out to wrap around her shoulders. One night, she settled beside him with a sigh, her bare feet tucked under her. "Grandpa," she said, after a while, her voice soft, "do you think they're watching us? Mom and Dad, I mean." The question hit him like a punch to the gut, but he kept his voice steady. "I think so," he said, staring out into the dark yard. "And if they are, I reckon they're proud of you." "Why me?" she asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "Because you've got a big heart," he said. "You care so much about everyone around you, even that scruffy dog over there." Ariana giggled, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "He's not scruffy. He's just unique." Maverick laughed, the sound unfamiliar in his own ears. "Fair enough," he said. One Saturday afternoon, they took Romeo to the park for the first time since his recovery. Ariana raced ahead, her laughter ringing out as she tossed a stick for Romeo to chase. Maverick stayed behind, watching from a distance with his hands in his pockets. She was a blur of motion, her ponytail bouncing, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Maverick couldn't remember the last time she'd looked so free. "Grandpa, did you see that?" she shouted, turning to wave at him. "He caught it in the air!" "I saw," Maverick called back, his voice tinged with pride. Romeo bounded toward her, tail wagging furiously, and Ariana knelt to hug him tightly. Maverick's chest tightened at the sight. It wasn't just the dog that had found a second chance. Ariana was healing too, slowly but surely. That night, as they sat by the fire with Romeo curled up at their feet, Maverick reached for Ariana's hand. She looked up at him, her eyes curious. "You know," he began, his voice low and steady, "I wasn't sure I could do this. Raising you on my own, after everything. But you've made it easier than I thought possible." Ariana's brows knit together. "I didn't do anything, Grandpa. You did more than you know," he said. "Every time you smile, every time you laugh, it reminds me that life's still worth living." She didn't say anything at first, just squeezed his hand tightly. "I'm glad we have each other," she whispered. Me too, Maverick said, his voice thick with emotion. Me too. In the quiet moments, after Ariana had fallen asleep and the house was still, Maverick often found himself sitting alone, thinking about the past and the uncertain future. But these days the weight of his grief was tempered by the warmth of his granddaughter's presence. Ariana didn't just survive, she thrived, despite everything they'd lost. It was a day like any other, the kind Maverick had come to cherish. The sun hung lazily in the afternoon sky, and the sound of children's laughter rang out across the park. Ariana had begged to go, her eyes bright with excitement. Maverick had relented with a grin, bringing Romeo along for the outing. Ariana darted ahead to join a group of kids kicking around a battered old soccer ball. Maverick settled onto a nearby bench, arms crossed, watching her with a soft smile. She was a blur of motion, her ponytail bouncing as she laughed and ran. Romeo sat dutifully by Maverick's feet, his dark eyes following Ariana's every move. But in an instant, everything changed. The ball rolled out of bounds, bouncing onto the street. Without hesitation, Ariana chased after it, her small legs carrying her toward the curb. Maverick stood abruptly, his heart lurching into his throat. "Ariana!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the air. She didn't hear him. A truck rounded the corner, its engine roaring like a distant storm growing closer. Maverick's legs felt like lead as he surged forward, but he was too far away. Time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once as the truck's horn blared and the brakes screeched. Hours later, Maverick sat in the sterile waiting room of the hospital, his head in his hands. The world outside those walls felt like a distant memory, the laughter of the park replaced by the deafening silence of despair. Romeo lay curled at his feet, unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his tail. A nurse had spoken to him briefly when they arrived, her face carefully composed but unable to mask the urgency in her tone. "We're doing everything we can," she had said before disappearing behind the double doors. Maverick had never felt so powerless. His hands trembled as he tried to pray, the words catching in his throat. He wasn't a religious man by nature, but in that moment he pleaded with any higher power that might be listening. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't take her from me. She's all I've got left." The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Nurses came and went, their faces unreadable. Maverick's chest felt tight, as if the air itself was conspiring against him. He clung to the hope that any moment now someone would come through those doors with good news. But when they finally did, the look on the doctor's face told him everything he needed to know. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, his voice low and measured. "We did all we could." Maverick stared at him, the words bouncing off him like distant echoes. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. "No," he said hoarsely, shaking his head. "You don't understand. She's a fighter. She'll come through this." The doctor's expression softened, but his words didn't change. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Edwards." The days that followed blurred into a haze of grief. Maverick moved through them on autopilot, his body going through the motions while his mind remained elsewhere. Romeo stayed close, his quiet presence both a comfort and a reminder of the gaping hole in their lives. When the day of the funeral arrived, Maverick steeled himself as best he could. The small chapel was filled with friends and neighbors, their hushed whispers filling the space like static. He stood by the casket, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the smooth wood. It was too small, too final. Romeo sat at his feet, his eyes locked on Maverick as if trying to absorb his pain. She was too Young, Maverick said softly, his voice breaking. She had so much ahead of her. The words felt hollow, insufficient to capture the depth of his loss. The service was brief but heavy with emotion, every word a dagger to his already shattered heart. He heard the sobs of those around him, felt the weight of their shared grief, but it did little to ease the ache inside him. As the final notes of the hymn faded into the still air, Maverick stood motionless beside the small casket, his hand resting on the polished wood. The murmurs of the gathered crowd blurred into a dull hum. He was dimly aware of Romeo pacing at his feet, the soft click of claws against the floor, a strange counterpoint to the oppressive quiet. Romeo's pacing grew more erratic. The dog circled the casket, his movements restless and sharp, his tail stiff and his ears alert. Then a low growl rumbled from his throat, catching Maverick's attention. "What is it, boy?" Maverick muttered under his breath, his voice cracked and worn. Romeo didn't answer, of course, but his agitation was impossible to ignore. His growl deepened, shifting into a frantic bark that echoed through the room. The mourners paused, their whispered condolences falling silent as all eyes turned toward the dog. "Romeo, stop," Maverick said, his tone sharper now, the words more out of reflex than conviction. But Romeo didn't stop. He lunged toward the casket, his front paws scraping against its base as his barks intensified. Maverick felt his stomach tighten, a mix of embarrassment and confusion washing over him. Romeo had always been a well-behaved dog, steady and composed, even in the worst of times. "Maybe he's just upset," a voice whispered from somewhere in the crowd. "Or maybe he senses something," someone else murmured. Maverick turned to Romeo, who now stood rigid, his nose pressed against the seam where the casket lid met the base. And then Maverick heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft, muffled tap, like the fluttering wings of a trapped bird. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest, straining to hear it again. There it was. It wasn't just a sound. It was a movement, weak but deliberate, coming from inside the casket. Maverick's knees buckled, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt around him. "Dear God," he whispered. "Ariana?" He grabbed the edge of the casket, his fingers trembling as he tried to steady himself. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, people stepping forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "She's gone, Maverick," someone said gently, reaching out to him. "You're just grieving." "No!" he barked, his voice breaking as he shoved the hand away. "She's in there! I heard her!" Romeo let out a sharp, insistent bark, as if to reinforce Maverick's claim. Maverick's hands fumbled at the latches, his desperation making him clumsy. A few people tried to intervene, murmuring that it wasn't right, that grief was clouding his judgment. But Romeo stood his ground, a barrier between Maverick and the crowd, his bared teeth warning anyone who dared to get too close. Finally, the lid gave way, and Maverick lifted it with a force he didn't know he had. His breath hitched as he looked inside. There she was, Ariana. Her face was pale, her body unnaturally still, but then, there it was. The faint rise and fall of her chest, the shallow flutter of breath escaping her lips. "She's alive," Maverick gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's alive!" The room erupted into chaos. Someone ran to call the paramedics, while others crowded around, their disbelief giving way to stunned murmurs. Maverick didn't care about any of it. He reached into the casket, his hands shaking as he cradled Ariana's fragile body. Her eyelids flickered, and a soft moan escaped her lips. "Grandpa," she murmured, her voice faint but unmistakable. "Oh, sweetheart," Maverick choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here. I'm right here." Romeo leapt up, his paws resting on the edge of the casket, his tail wagging furiously. He let out a series of high-pitched barks, his excitement palpable as he licked Ariana's hand. The paramedics arrived within minutes, ushering Maverick aside so they could examine her. One of them turned to the crowd, his face pale as he explained the unexplainable. "It's catalepsy," he said. "A rare condition where the body mimics death. She must have been in a deep state of unconsciousness." Maverick barely heard him. All he could see was Ariana, now resting on a stretcher, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The drive back to the hospital was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the ambulance engine. Maverick sat in the corner of the vehicle, his eyes glued to Ariana's pale face. Her breathing was shallow but steady, each rise and fall of her chest a small miracle he couldn't take for granted. Romeo sat obediently at his feet, his dark eyes darting between Maverick and Ariana, as though he too was keeping watch. By the time they arrived, the hospital staff was ready. Doctors and nurses bustled around, their movements quick but purposeful. Maverick stood aside, his fists clenched tightly as they wheeled her into a room. A nurse offered him a chair, but he shook his head. Sitting felt wrong, too much like giving in. The hours stretched into the early morning. Maverick remained by her bedside, his rough hands gently brushing strands of hair from her face. The doctors, now cautious in every word they spoke, assured him they were doing all they could. "I should have known," one of them admitted, a young man with weary eyes. "Catalepsy is rare, but I should have double-checked. I'm so sorry." Maverick didn't respond. There was no anger in him, only an overwhelming sense of gratitude that she was still here. "Just make sure she's all right," he said finally, his voice gruff with exhaustion. The days that followed were slow but filled with signs of progress. Ariana stirred more often, her eyes flickering open briefly before closing again. Each time she woke, even for a moment, it was like a lifeline for Maverick. He refused to leave her side, not even for a cup of coffee or a brief nap. "You need rest, Mr. Edwards," one nurse said gently, her concern evident. "I'll rest when she's better," Maverick replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Romeo was his constant companion. Hospital rules didn't seem to apply to the dog anymore, not after the role he'd played in saving Ariana's life. The staff even left a small bowl of water and a blanket for him in the corner of her room. Romeo rarely left Maverick's feet, his head resting on his paws, his gaze fixed on Ariana as though willing her to wake. It was a quiet afternoon when Ariana finally opened her eyes fully. Maverick had been dozing in his chair, the first time he'd allowed himself even a moment of rest. Romeo's soft bark roused him, and he sat up with a start, his heart pounding. "Grandpa?" Ariana's voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was the sweetest sound Maverick had ever heard. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, leaning forward to take her hand in his. His voice cracked, the weight of his relief threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm right here." Romeo jumped onto the bed, his tail wagging furiously as he licked Ariana's hand. She smiled faintly, her small fingers curling into his fur. "I missed you," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "We missed you, too," Maverick replied, his throat tight. As the days turned into weeks, Ariana grew stronger. Her pale complexion gave way to a healthier glow, and her laughter, though still soft, began to fill the room once more. She still tired easily, but Maverick didn't mind carrying her when her legs gave out. He'd carry her forever if it meant keeping her safe. Romeo became her constant shadow, following her everywhere she went. When she sat in her wheelchair, Romeo would trot alongside, his nose occasionally nudging her hand, as if to remind her he was there. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Ariana turned to Maverick with a thoughtful expression. "Grandpa," she began, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "do you think Romeo knew I wasn't gone?" Maverick nodded slowly. "I think he did, sweetheart. Dogs, like him, they know things. They feel things we don't always understand." Ariana leaned down to scratch behind Romeo's ears, her smile widening as the dog closed his eyes in contentment. "He saved me," she said softly. "Didn't he?" "He sure did," Maverick replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And he saved me, too." The little family began to find their rhythm again. Days were filled with simple joys, puzzles spread out on the kitchen table, Romeo chasing after sticks in the yard, and Maverick's steady hand guiding Ariana through her therapy exercises. "Slow and steady," he'd remind her whenever she grew frustrated, his voice calm but firm. "I'll get there," she'd reply, determination shining in her eyes. And she did. Bit by bit, Ariana regained her strength. By the time autumn leaves began to scatter across the lawn, she was walking again, her steps careful but confident. Maverick watched her with a pride that made his chest ache. She wasn't just his granddaughter, she was his reason for everything. And Romeo? He was more than a dog now. He was their guardian, their anchor, their reminder that miracles were possible. Maverick sat at the kitchen table, a battered leather journal open in front of him. His hand moved slowly, the pen pressing against the paper as he scrawled words he hadn't yet spoken aloud. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Romeo lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, while Ariana's laughter filtered in faintly through the window. She was outside with the neighbors' kids, playing the way children should, free and full of life. It hadn't been easy getting here. The scars left by that day at the park ran deeper than anyone could see, but Ariana was resilient. Maverick had watched her face, her fears head-on, holding Romeo's leash tightly as she walked past the very street where the accident happened. He'd seen her sit quietly at night, stroking Romeo's fur, her eyes distant as she processed memories too heavy for someone so young. "Grandpa, I'm not afraid anymore," she'd said one evening, her voice soft but steady. "Not as much as before. Romeo makes me brave." Maverick had smiled then, his throat tight with emotion. "You've always been brave, sweetheart," he'd told her. "Romeo just reminded you." By the time school started again, Ariana had regained her strength, though Maverick worried about sending her back. The world felt too big, too unpredictable, and the thought of her being out of his sight made his chest ache. But when he saw her standing at the bus stop, her backpack slung over one shoulder and Romeo sitting obediently by her side, something inside him shifted. She was ready, and he couldn't hold her back. The first week was a mix of relief and adjustment. Ariana came home each day with stories about her classmates, her voice animated as she recounted their antics. "Miss Harper said I should write about Romeo for show and tell," she told Maverick one afternoon, her face lighting up. "She says everyone loves a good dog story." "That's because Romeo's the best," Maverick replied, scratching the dog behind the ears. Ariana grinned. "Can you help me? I don't want to leave anything out." The journal on the kitchen table was part of something bigger, a project Maverick had started in the quiet hours of the night. The idea had come to him gradually, a way to honor what they'd been through and the lessons they'd learned. It wasn't just about the accident or Ariana's miraculous recovery. It was about love, resilience, and the bond that had carried them through. I want to tell our story, Maverick had explained to Ariana one evening. She'd been sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, colouring in a picture of Romeo. Our story? She'd asked, tilting her head. Yours, mine, and Romeo's, he said. What we've been through together. I think it could help other people. Maybe give them hope. Ariana had nodded thoughtfully. I think that's a good idea, she said. Then, with a small smile, she added, but you'll need me to make sure you get all the details right. The process became a shared journey. Maverick wrote about his early days with Ariana, how she'd been his anchor after losing her parents. He wrote about Romeo's arrival, how the little dog had filled a space they didn't even realize was empty. And when it came to the accident and its aftermath, he took his time, letting the words come slowly, carefully. Ariana often sat beside him, her small hands turning the pages as she read what he'd written. You forgot about the time Romeo barked at the nurse, she said once, giggling. He thought she was trying to hurt me when she checked my IV. Maverick chuckled. You're right, I'll add that. Romeo, as if understanding he was the subject of their conversation, wagged his tail lazily. By the time the leaves turned golden and began to scatter across the yard, the journal was nearly full. Ariana returned to school with confidence, her steps steady and sure. Romeo continued to be her shadow, a loyal guardian who never let her wander too far from his sight. One chilly evening, Maverick and Ariana sat on the porch, a blanket draped over their laps. The stars above were bright, the kind of sky that seemed to stretch on forever. Grandpa, Ariana said, her voice quiet, do you think we'll ever forget what happened? Maverick looked at her, his weathered face softening. No, sweetheart, he said. We won't forget. But that's not a bad thing. What we've been through, it's part of who we are now. And it's made us stronger. She nodded, her gaze drifting to Romeo, who was curled up at their feet. He's part of it too, she said. He is, Maverick agreed. More than we'll ever be able to explain. The first snow of the season had come overnight, blanketing the yard in a pristine layer of white. Maverick stood by the window, sipping his coffee as the morning sun reflected off the snowbanks, casting a soft glow into the room. He watched as Ariana bounded outside, her laughter echoing against the quiet of the neighborhood. Romeo trailed behind her, his tail wagging furiously, leaving a zigzag trail in the untouched snow. It had been Ariana's idea to host the party. We should thank everyone, Grandpa, she'd said, her face lighting up with excitement, for being there for us, and for Romeo too. Maverick had smiled, his heart swelling at her thoughtfulness. All right, he'd agreed, but you're in charge of decorations. I'm not much for frilly stuff. The preparations began in earnest a week before Christmas. Ariana insisted on stringing lights across the porch, her mittened hands fumbling with the clips as Maverick held the ladder steady. I want it to look magical, she declared, stepping back to admire her work. It does, sweetheart, Maverick said, his voice warm. You've got an eye for this. Romeo watched from the yard, occasionally barking at the strands of lights as they swayed in the wind. Inside, the house was filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. A modest tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches adorned with homemade ornaments Ariana had crafted over the years. Maverick hung a simple star at the top, stepping back to let Ariana add the finishing touches. We should make one for Romeo, she suggested, holding up a scrap of ribbon. Maverick chuckled. He'd probably eat it, he said. The evening of the party arrived, and the house buzzed with warmth and laughter. Friends and neighbors filled the living room, their hands wrapped around mugs of hot cider. Ariana darted through the crowd, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she introduced Romeo to anyone who hadn't yet met him. "This is Romeo," she said proudly. "He's a hero." Romeo seemed to understand the attention, his tail wagging as he soaked in the affection. Maverick watched from the edge of the room, his chest tightening with gratitude. At one point, Ariana stood at the front of the room, her small frame illuminated by the glow of the Christmas tree. She cleared her throat, a mix of nerves and determination crossing her face. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice steady but soft. "To everyone who helped us when things were hard, and to Romeo, for saving me." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, followed by a round of applause. Romeo barked as if joining in, and the room erupted in laughter. Maverick stepped forward, his hand resting on Ariana's shoulder. "We've been through a lot," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we're here because of all of you. And because of this little guy," he added, glancing down at Romeo. As the night wore on, the guests began to leave, their goodbyes lingering as they bundled up against the cold. Ariana spent the rest of the evening in the living room, her arms wrapped around Romeo as she opened the gifts he'd received. A plush toy shaped like a bone, a new leash, and a tin of gourmet dog treats. "He's spoiled now," Maverick teased, sitting in his chair by the fire. "He deserves it," Ariana replied, hugging Romeo tighter. Maverick nodded, his gaze softening. "Yeah," he said. "He does." Later, as the house fell quiet again, Maverick found himself on the porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Ariana joined him, Romeo trotting behind her and curling up at their feet. The stars above were clear and bright, the kind of sky that reminded him of how small and precious life truly was. "Grandpa," Ariana said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "do you think people really understand how special Romeo is?" Maverick smiled, glancing down at the dog who had become so much more than a pet. "I think the ones who matter do," he said. "And that's enough." Ariana nodded, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the porch lights. "He's more than a dog," she said. "He's family," Maverick agreed. As Christmas morning dawned, the little family spent it in the quiet comfort of each other's company. Ariana opened her gifts with wide-eyed excitement, Romeo eagerly tearing into the wrapping paper of his own presents. Maverick sat back, soaking in the scene, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. When the afternoon came, the three of them ventured out into the snow for a walk. The world was still and serene, the air crisp against their cheeks. Ariana held Romeo's leash tightly, her laughter ringing out as the dog bounded ahead, his joy infectious. Maverick walked beside her, his steps slow but steady. He looked at the horizon, the sun dipping low and casting the snow in hues of gold and pink. For the first time in a long while, the ache in his chest was replaced with something lighter, something he could only describe as peace. "We're lucky," Ariana said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Maverick glanced at her, his weathered face breaking into a soft smile. "We are," he said. "Luckier than most." And as they walked into the fading light, the weight of the past seemed to melt away, leaving only the warmth of the present and the promise of tomorrow. Together they had weathered the storm, and together they would embrace whatever came next. The story of Maverick, Ariana, and Romeo is a profound journey of love, resilience, and healing. It begins with devastating loss, but blossoms into a narrative of hope, anchored by the strength of family bonds and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who becomes more than a companion. He becomes a savior. Maverick's transformation from a grief-stricken grandfather to a man renewed by his love for Ariana and his gratitude for Romeo is both heartwarming and inspiring. Ariana's courage in overcoming her trauma with Romeo by her side illustrates the incredible capacity of the human spirit to heal when nurtured by unconditional love. This journey is a testament to the power of connection between people and animals. Romeo's instinctive devotion not only saves Ariana's life, but also rekindles Maverick's faith in the beauty of the present. Together, their small family demonstrates that even in the face of immense sorrow, joy and purpose can be rediscovered. The story leaves readers with a deeply human lesson, that love, loyalty and gratitude have the power to transcend hardship, turning pain into strength and loss into a foundation for new beginnings. It's a poignant reminder to cherish every moment and every bond we hold dear. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.